15 years ago, when I was working as an intern at a hospital in Chinju, a young man was rushed into the emergency room early in the morning. He was just 26 years old. He had suffered a serious head injury after falling from a construction site. His face and head were so badly damaged that he was unrecognizable. He had already lost consciousness when he arrived. We immediately began working on him, doing everything we could to save him. But deep down, we all knew that the chances of him surviving were almost non-existent. His injuries were severe. He was in a near comatose state, connected to a ventilator to help him breathe. As I stood there watching him, I felt a deep sadness. I had seen many injuries before, but something about this case felt different. It was hard to accept that such a young man, with his whole life ahead of him, there with no chance of survival. I tried to push those thoughts aside as I focused on the task at hand. But as I worked, I couldn't help but think about his family. What would they feel when they found out the truth? What would they do? These thoughts weighed heavily on my mind. After stabilizing him as best we could, I looked at the heart rate monitor beside his bed. My chest tightened when I noticed that the steady, normal rhythm of his heartbeat had suddenly changed. The lines on the screen were no longer consistent. Regular rhythm was weakening, and I had seen this pattern before. It was a sign that death was near. In most cases, once this change occurred, the patient did not survive for more than a few minutes. I left the ICU and went to speak with his family, who were waiting outside. "He doesn't have much time left," I told them gently. "You should come and say your final goodbyes." His parents and relatives were already heartbroken, though they tried to stay strong. They went into the room, gathered around him, and began crying. They held his hands, whispered their goodbyes, and kissed his forehead. It was a heartbreaking sight, and I couldn't help but feel sympathy for them. I stepped out of the ICU, my heart heavy with sorrow. I instructed the nurses to prepare for his body to be moved to the morgue once his heart stopped completely. The hours passed, and I went on to attend to other patients. The emergency room was busy as always, with new cases coming in one after the other. By the end of the day, I was completely exhausted. It was hard to think about anything else when I was so drained from the chaos of the ER. Still, something about that young man's case lingered in my mind. The next morning, as I walked through the hospital, I couldn't shake the thought of him. Something felt off. It was as if my mind kept pulling me back to that ICU room, even though I had already prepared myself for the worst. Without thinking, I found myself heading back to the ICU to check on him again. When I walked in, I couldn't believe my eyes. His heart was still beating. It was weak and irregular, but it was still beating. He was still alive, against all odds. The monitors displayed weak signals, but he was holding on. I couldn't understand it. His injuries should have already taken his life. How was he still alive? I stayed in the ICU for a while, trying to make sense of it, but my mind kept racing with questions. How could this be happening? I had never seen anything like it before. I had been a doctor for several years by then. Yet here I was, witnessing something that defied all logic and reason. I had no answers. By the time afternoon came around, I was too busy with other emergency patients to focus on him. The emergency room was always filled with chaos. But the next morning, as soon as I arrived at the hospital, I found myself heading straight for the ICU once more. His heart was still beating, though faintly. His body should have already given up by now. It was impossible for him to be alive. But there he was, as if he was holding on for something, refusing to give up. I stood there, watching him, wondering why he was still alive. It didn't make sense. There was no scientific explanation for it. But somehow, he was still there, as if something was keeping him in this world. Just then, the doors of the ICU opened, and a young woman rushed in. She looked out of breath, as if she had been running. She had not been one of the family members I had seen earlier. Her face was pale, and her eyes were full of shock. She barely looked at the man lying in the bed. It seemed as though she was about to collapse, her emotions overwhelming her. I stepped aside to let her approach. I could see the pain in her face. She slowly walked to the side of his bed, and then, something incredible happened. At that very moment, the heart monitor flatlined. The weak signals that had been there for the past 2 days suddenly disappeared. The screen, once flickering with life, showed only a single straight line. His heartbeat, which had been stubbornly refusing to stop for so long, finally stopped. It was as though he had been waiting for her to arrive before he could let go. A strange, powerful feeling washed over me. It was as if his soul had been holding on just to see her one last time. I quietly stepped out of the ICU and went to speak with the family. After informing them of his passing, I turned to one of the relatives and asked, "Who is she?" The answer left me speechless. "She's his wife. They had been married for only 3 months and she's carrying his baby." I was stunned. The emotions I felt at that moment were indescribable. It was as though everything had suddenly fallen into place. I understood now why he had fought so hard, why he had held on for so long. After she left the ICU, I waited for her in the hallway. When she came out, I gently approached her and spoke. "He fought for so long just to see you one last time. He held on, hoping to meet you and your baby. He endured a painful battle, waiting for you. His final message to you was a farewell of love." Her tears fell freely as she listened to my words. At that moment, I realized something that went beyond my years of medical training. There are things in this world that science cannot explain. Some things can't be understood through logic or reason alone. And the most powerful force in this world, the force that can keep someone's soul from leaving, is love.